Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Yoma Daf Mem Tes continues a list of Shailas, questions, and halacha about the Kohen Gadol's scooping of Ketores on Yom Kippur. The Gemara has a few more Shailas to ask, and the Gemara will actually have, some of them will be intertwined with other ones, so we'll mention ones that are coming up in order to figure out ones that we're discussing now. And the Gemara will do its best to figure some of them out. So let's begin. We're beginning quite a few lines into the daf by the first shayla that's begun on the daf. Says Rav Papa, I have a question. The Kohen Gadol is supposed to scoop the ketores into his two hands, two combined handfuls. The question is, what if somebody else scoops it and puts it into the Kohen Gadol's hands? Is that a problem or not? What's the question center around? The pasuk, when it describes the avodah, says that he should be v'lokach, he should take Maloi Chafnov. He should take a scoopful, two handfuls of ketores and the coals, and vehevi, he should bring it. The question is, what is V'lakach referring to? V'lakach is referring to he should take the coals and he should bring handfuls of ketores, but it doesn't necessarily say that he should take the handfuls. Or is V'lakach also going on the handfuls and saying he should take handfuls, meaning he should himself make them into handfuls, and he should bring them in? So again, the question is, when it says V'lakach, is that referring to the coals, or is that referring to the handfuls? We know that he has to do behavior on the handfuls, he has to bring the handfuls into the Kodesh Kodashim. The question is, does he have to take the handfuls, or could somebody else take the handfuls and give them to the Kohen Gadol, as long as it's his handfuls and he's bringing them in, it fulfills the psukim. Gemara leaves that unresolved. The Gemara says, Tegu. Now the Gemara has a question of Rabbi Shua ben Levi that says, what if the Kohen Gadol takes the handfuls himself, but then something happens to him? He dies, or maybe he becomes disqualified, and somebody else takes over. Is that second Kohen Gadol now allowed to use the original Kohen Gadol's handfuls? This is one step further than the question before. He's still using somebody else's, but in this case, both handfuls were done by a Kohen Gadol. So you don't have the problem, even if the word of V'lakach is referring to the handfuls, the V'lakach was done by a Kohen Gadol. And it's being taken over by a different Kohen Gadol who's going to do the Vehevi. But it wasn't the same Kohen Gadol necessarily. Is that a problem or not? So now the Gemara has a bit of a detour here. The Gemara discusses this question. The Gemara first of all says that this was asked by Rabbi Shua ben Levi. So when Rabbi Chanina heard that Rabbi Shua ben Levi asked it, he said, oh great, look, one of the older people is asking my question. He said, She'elas harishonim, bo re'ei she'elas harishonim. It's the question of the old ones, meaning my question, he was also bothered by the same thing, was asked by the old ones. The Gemara says, that can't be the pshat over here, because Rabbi Chanina was older than Rabbi Shua ben Levi. So why would he refer to Rabbi Shua ben Levi as the older ones? How do you know that he was older than Rabbi Shua ben Levi? Well, we have a quote from Rabbi Shua ben Levi that seems to indicate it. Rabbi Shua ben Levi says that Rabbi Chanina, he calls him Rabbi, his Rabbi Chanina told me that I'm allowed to drink shachalayim on Shabbos. Shachalayim is a type of food called cress. You're allowed to drink it on Shabbos. Why would I not be? So shachalayim has medical properties. You're generally not allowed to take medicine on Shabbos unless you're really a state called a chola. But Rabbi Chanina said that he's allowed to. Now, shachalayim is food. So the Gemara says, well, what's the chiddush there? Shachalayim is real food. Even though it has medical properties, it's still food. You're allowed to eat food and drink drinks, even if they help medically. If normal people eat it and drink it not for a food, there's no problem to eat it and to drink it on Shabbos. So Gemara says, no, what happened here was not only did he let him eat it, he actually let him grind it up on Shabbos and eat it. Gemara says, grind it up? Grinding is an issur d'oraisa on Shabbos. How could he allow him to do that? Gemara says it was a sakana. It was the status of a chalish yesh bar sakana. Gemara says, well then what was the question? Why did you have to ask him? Gemara says he wasn't asking him if it's mutter, he was asking him if the shachalayim will help him. If the shachalayim medically help him, so then he's allowed to. If they won't help him, he will not. He wasn't asking a halacha question, he was asking a medical question. Because Rabbi Chanina was an expert in the medicinal properties of various different things. As we could see that from a different incident where Rabbi Chanina said, and no one ever consulted me on a wound that was caused by the kick of a white mule and lived. So you see, Rabbi Chanina was consulted often on medical things. So the Gemara says, no one lived from a white mule. You're trying to say that the kick of a white mule is fatal? It's not true. We've seen many people who get kicked by a white mule and they survive. So the Gemara says, no, you got the the wrong word here. It's not that he said, I never saw someone who was v'chaya, who lived, but v'chayas, and that he was healed, meaning the kick of a white mule doesn't heal. Versus what we do see that we've seen people who have the kick of a white mule and it heals. Versus it's referring to a particular type of mule. It's referring to a red mule with white feet. That situation it's not going to heal. But anyway, getting back to our issue, we do see here that Rabbi Yeshua referred to Rabbi Chanina as Rebbe. So therefore he was obviously younger than Rabbi Chanina. So why would Rabbi Chanina hear him ask a question and say, oh look, the old ones are asking our questions? So the Gemara says you have to change slightly what the wording was. He didn't say She'ela shel Rishonim, he said She'ela son Kishe'ela shel Rishonim, meaning their question is like the old ones, and he's referring to himself. He's calling himself the old one, and he's saying these new young guys are asking a question like me, like the old ones. The Gemara says, but that can't be either, because Rabbi Chanina cannot possibly have been bothered by the question of whether the second Kohen Gadol, the replacement, is allowed to use the ketores that was scooped up by the first Kohen Gadol. Why can he not be asking that? The Gemara says because of a later Shaila, which we're going to discuss near the end of the daf, and that is when a Kohen Gadol is replaced, does he have to bring a new par? Does he have to redo the slaughtering of the cow, which was a korban chatas for the Kohen Gadol? Does he have to take a new live cow and slaughter it, or could he use the blood of the old cow? That's assuming, of course, that the blood wasn't put on the mizbeach yet. So Rabbi Chanina holds that you can't use the blood of the old cow, you have to slaughter a new cow. And Rabbi Chanina also holds that you can't scoop ketores before the cow is slaughtered. So since a new cow has to be slaughtered, obviously a new ketores has to be scooped, and therefore there's no way he could use the old scoop. So Gemara says you're right. Rabbi Chanina wasn't bothered by this. However, what Rabbi Chanina meant to say was that these younger people obviously hold like my disputants. They hold like the people who argue with me and hold that you do not have to bring a new cow, and therefore you could use the old ketores. Theoretically, you could use the old ketores, and their question is there a problem in the fact that it was scooped by a different person to use the old ketores or not? And their question is similar to a question that the older people had, not me, meaning those people who argue with me and hold that it's even an issue. Now, the Gemara pursues this question, which means the Gemara seems to hold not like Rabbi Chanina. The Gemara pursues it, and the Gemara says, what's the answer to the question? So the Gemara says that Rav Papa said it really depends in a sense on another question. And that question is when the Kohen Gadol takes the ketores scooped in his hands, which he then transferred to a kli, into a spoon. He takes that spoon into the Kodesh Kodashim, does he pour it directly onto the coals from the spoon, or does he have to transfer it back into his hands? Now, if he's transferred it back into his hands, says Rav Papa, then it's logical to say that he could use the old ketores taken by the former Kohen. Why? Because at least he's doing something in his hands. He's doing a maloch chafnav also. He's going to put it into his hands in the Kodesh Kodashim before he transfers it onto the coals itself. However, if he's not putting it in his hands, if he's going to pour it directly from the kli, then he's never going to do a maloch chafnav this Kohen. It's logical, therefore, that we make him redo the scooping, and he can't use the ketores scooped up by the old Kohen. So Gemara says that's how Rav Papa saw it. The Gemara says Rav Huna Bray Rav Yeshua said, I agree with you, it's dependent on the question, but I think it's the opposite. I think that if the Kohen's going to have to transfer it from the spoon back to his hands, then he has to do his own scooping, because if it was scooped up by somebody else, it's not going to fit in his hands. It'll either be too much or too little. He can't have too much, and he can't have too little. That's the halacha. He's not allowed to drop a grain. It has to be exactly a handful. So then it would not be advisable for him to use a maloch chafnav of somebody else. If, however, he's just going to pour it straight from the kli, so let him use the old one. What's the difference? It doesn't seem to affect anything over here. Okay. Now the Gemara investigates more deeply the question of, does the Kohen Gadol have to transfer it back into his hands in the Kodesh Kodashim, or does he pour directly from the spoon onto the coals in the Kodesh Kodashim? And the Gemara tries to bring a couple of proofs. The Gemara first of all refers to our old Mishnah. The Mishnah had discussed the Malach Chafnav, and it said Kach Haisa Midasa. This was the measure. So the Gemara now asks, what did the Mishnah mean when it said this was the measure? Apparently, it means to say that just like he did a Malach Chafnav outside Kodesh Kodashim, this is the measure that he did again. The same Malach Chafnav he does again inside, which seems to indicate that he has to return it from the spoon to his hands and put it on the coals from his hands. Which is not, as we said earlier, it's not necessarily what it means. It could be referring to other things. It could be saying that he's allowed to use a kli, a measuring cup, that's the size of his melech hafnav. He does not have to scoop it with his hands. He can measure out. It just has to be an amount of melech hafnav. It doesn't have to actually be in his hands. Another thing that it might mean is that it might be teaching that you can't have more and you can't have less. It has to be exactly a melech hafnav in the Kodesh Kodashim, just like it was outside the Kodesh Kodashim when he first scooped it up. So again, we don't know exactly what the Mishnah means by this line, and therefore you can't prove anything with it. Gemara says, okay, I'll prove you from a different Mishnah. The different Mishnah describes exactly how he transferred the melech hafnav from the spoon into his hands, back into his hands in the Kodesh Kodashim. And that clearly indicates that he does have to do that. The Gemara accepts that as a proof, but let's see that Mishnah. The Mishnah says, how is he going to transfer it? He needs both hands to hold the ketoros that he's pouring out of the spoon. Then how's he going to hold the spoon while he's doing that? So the Gemara says he's actually going to rest it on his forearms. He puts his forearms together, rests the spoon between them. And with his thumbs, he slides the spoon up his hands, meaning he holds it originally in his hands and he lies it on his forearms. Then he slides it backwards up his arms until he gets back to his elbow, and then he leans forward, or he moves his arm, he angles his arm downward so that it pours out of the spoon into his hands, and that way he will not drop any of it. Now, what does he do with it afterwards? So the Gemara says he puts it on the coals. The Brisa says he puts it on the coals. So machlokas is if he throws it all on in one heap. That way it will burn slowly and the smoke will fill slowly. It's more covered that way. Or if he scatters it around all over the coals, then it'll burn quickly and the room will fill with smoke right away. That way he won't look at anything and he could leave quickly, and Klal Yisrael was worried about it. The Brisa stands off and it says this is the hardest avoda that there was in the Beis Hamikdash. The Gemara says this is the hardest. There are other hard ones. Malika, Kmitza, we've just discussed that yesterday on the Daf. So it's okay, it's not necessarily the hardest, but one of the hardest. Okay, anyway, what we clearly see from here is that he does put it back into his hands. And the Gemara leaves that as a final determination. Now the Gemara refers back to a question which we discussed earlier, which was if a Kohen Gadol is replaced after the par, after his cow, Chatas, was slaughtered, but before the blood was put on the Mizbeach, can he go take that blood and put it on the Mizbeach, or does he have to take a whole new cow and slaughter the whole new cow? So the Gemara says it's a machlokes. Rabbi Chanina and Rabbi Ami say he has to take a new cow. However, Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha say he could use the old cow. What's the reason? So the question is, when the pasuk describes it, it says, Bezos Yavoy Aaron El HaKodesh Befar Ben Bakar. He has to bring a cow. He has to bring a cow with him when he comes into the Kodesh Kodashim. So he has to bring the cow with him. Does that mean he has to bring a live cow? Or is bringing just the blood of a cow, a slaughtered cow, also count as a cow? The word cow, when it says a par, does that have to mean a live cow? Could it also mean A, a slaughtered cow, and B, the blood of a cow? So Gemara says, let's try to bring a couple of proofs to this question itself. So Gemara's first one is asked by Rav Ami to Dafcha, and it's referring to the Korban Pesach, and it says that people have to sign up for the Korban Pesach, or withdraw from the Korban Pesach before Shechita. Once Shechita happens, you can't change anymore. Now, that would seem to indicate that the reason is because the Torah said that you have to sign up while it's still called a seh, while it's still called a lamb. Once you slaughter it, obviously, it's not called a lamb anymore. That proves that a slaughtered animal, or the blood of the animal, is not called an animal. It's only when it's still alive that's called the animal, and therefore the par is not called a par. When we say he has to bring a par, it means he has to bring a live par, not somebody else's par that was already slaughtered and bring its blood. So says that's different. We have a drasha there by the Korban Pesach that specifically says that the seh has to be alive, because it says mihiyos miseh, which we read as michiyusa deseh. Well, while it's still alive, there we have a special limit. It has to be alive. It's not because it's not called a seh anymore after it's already slaughtered. Really, it is called a seh, and the par is called a par even after it's been slaughtered. But there is a special halacha. Which is okay. I'll bring you a second proof. When you redeem a firstborn of a chamor, a pidyon peter chamor, it says you have to redeem in exchange for a seh. If a brisa that says when you use a seh, so you have to do the following thing. You have to use a seh. You cannot use a calf. You cannot use any other animal. You can't use a slaughtered animal, a slaughtered seh. You can't use a treifa, a ripped animal. You can't use kilayim, a mixed breed. You can't use a koi, another type of mixed breed. It's got to be a seh. So Gemara says, you see here clearly, a koi would be a mix of a wild sheep and a domesticated sheep. So Gemara says, you see again, it's got to be a seh, not a slaughtered seh. So clearly again, You see that as long as it's been slaughtered, it's not called a seh anymore. So Gemara says, okay, this halacha is learned out from Hilchos Pesach. We just said that in Hilchos Pesach this is a special Gzeres because of it says Mihi Yois Miseh. So here also the word seh is used, so we link this seh to that seh. They're both called a seh. So Gemara says, if you're going to learn that to those halachas, so then you should eliminate all the other things that don't qualify for Karban Pesach itself. For example, it should have to be a zachar, it should have to be male, and it should have to be unblemished, and it should have to be a year old, younger than a year old. So Gemara says, why don't you learn all the halachas? Gemara says, no, those halachas are limited in the fact that when it describes the pidyon, Petach Chamar uses the word tifte, you shall redeem, and uses the word twice. Actually uses it 3 times in the pasuk. Says v'chol Petach Chamar tifte b'sev, v'moi tifte v'harafte, v'chol b'char adam b'vanechot tifte. So the first 2 tiftes are referring to the redemption of the Chamar. So it's twice it says tifte referring to the redemption of the Chamar. That includes you could use more things. So you could use things that does not apply to the Karban Pesach. So you could use a seh, it doesn't have to be tam, it doesn't have to be ben shana, but it does still say seh, and therefore we do learn something out of Karban Pesach, and what we learn out of that is it has to be alive and it cannot be used.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.